Happy Tuesday, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today we have Brandon DaCruz on the podcast again. So, first of all, thanks to Brandon for coming on again and being our first ever repeat guest. And then secondly, what we're going to talk about today is going to be a very, very interesting topic. I'm super excited to get into this. So we're pretty much going to be covering all things insulin, endogenous insulin, meaning your body's natural production of insulin. What that is, why it's important, insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, and how these things impact not only your health, but your physique-related endeavors as well. But before we dive into all of these things with Bryan, what's the latest with you?
What's the latest? To your advice, I just started taking 3,000 milligrams of sodium before my workouts. Maybe 3 or 4 days ago I started this, and subjectively, for whatever it's worth, I feel like I'm more full during workouts, and it might be placebo effect, but I feel like I'm just a little more kind of with it and engaged. And the reason, for anyone that doesn't know, I just had blood work done recently, and my sodium came back fine, but Straker pointed to something that not too many other people that looked at the blood work did. Actually, he was the only one, that I kind of seem to have a bit of just general dehydration in my body. And he's not the first person to say that. I had blood work done in 2016, and the person that read it kind of said the same thing, but no one was really sure what was going on because I constantly have 1.5, maybe even 2 gallons of liquid a day. So initially I thought maybe I'm drinking too much liquid, and then it was potentially diluting the sodium, I think was where Aaron went with that. And then we kind of did a reference of how much sodium I get in a general day, and it really wasn't. It was 1,500 milligrams maybe at the tops. So now I'm adding in 3,000 milligrams pre-workout. I posed the question to Aaron whether I should do it on off days as well, which he hasn't responded to yet, but I went ahead and I took it anyways. So I have my 3,000 milligrams of sodium in my body. I'm here podcasting. My body weight is up this morning or yesterday morning, and then again this morning. I'm thinking this is the water retention from the sodium. Aaron and Brandon are nodding their heads, so I think I'm on the right path. And excited to get my body hydrated, see what happens here.
Yeah, real quick on that. I sorry for not responding. I don't know where I dropped it, but I know we're having like different conversations in different mediums.
Yeah.
I personally don't take it on days that I'm not training, but I salt a lot of my meals. It's something that I would recommend a lot of people do, especially if you're an athlete training. Pink Himalayan sea salt or a different type of sea salt. For people who are, concerned about, well, what about sodium and blood pressure? To answer this in a very, very short way, salt isn't the reason your blood pressure's high. Your blood pressure's high because you live a lifestyle that leads to high blood pressure, or potentially some genetic type stuff. But for a majority of people, especially lean, healthy population, some salt will help, especially in the gym and performance and stuff. So.
Cool. Well, I'll probably not take it on off days then, but
Yeah.
but today I did, so I'm just trying to load my sodium, so to speak.
Yeah. And then eventually it will just keep it in most days, and then the weight will kind of balance when the different salt retention in the kidneys and stuff. It's cyclical. So,
Cool.
Brandon, what's the latest with you the last couple of days?
Guys, it's been a busy weekend. This past weekend was my anniversary, so I took a little time off from work. First time in months. We did a spa day, and then I'm getting ready. It's a very busy week ahead. I am heading out to Tennessee on Thursday for the Physique Education Collective, which I believe you've went to before, Aaron. So I'm excited to see my boys Jeff Black, Jason Theobald, and Jeffrey Sue, who are going to be presenting out there. So it's going to be a busy week of continuing education, of work. Clients have been doing really well. Just onboarded 3 clients within the last few days. So business has been going well. Training's been going well. And, I'm pleased to be here again. I appreciate you guys having me back so quickly.
Awesome.
For
Yeah.
sure.
The PEC is pretty sweet. I was debating on whether to go again, but they're presenting like basically the same topics more or less.
Exactly.
So I'm gonna skip this one. But yeah, it's always a super cool experience to just meet a bunch of other cool people in the industry doing really cool work and presenting on topics that a lot of people really aren't talking about at like a very high level. You kind of dig in and learn. So I'm super excited that you're gonna go see that.
Hell yeah. I am too. It's funny because you interact with people on the internet for years. Like I've been going back and forth with Jason since 2012. Jeff, I've known for years. I've been on phone calls with him for hours at a time. I mentor under Vince Pitstick. I've known Austin since 2015. So it's like finally all the worlds are colliding. You're able to interact on the internet, build friendships like I have with you two, despite us not having met, and then being able to see them in person, we'll be able to train and then also learn in the process. Honestly, there's nothing better than that.
Exactly. Yeah. Networking, learning, expanding. It's all really, really cool, especially with like-minded people.
Totally
For myself,
agree.
My coaching is open. That's the biggest, the news for me here. It's open until May 31st. I open it in segments every handful of months, only a few times per year. So if you are a male listening to this, looking to learn a lot more about topics like we're going to speak about today, this morning, right now, please reach out to me. Like I said, open until May 31st. And just a caveat, this is for males only. Sorry, ladies. But if you are a lady looking for coaching, Brandon, right? Do you work with
Absolutely.
women?
I work with
An
plenty of
option.
females, all ages.
Or ping me, and I have resources I generally refer women out to that reach out to me too. So let's dig into this. So I think starting at the most highest level, Brandon, can you just kind of briefly introduce us to what is insulin, and then maybe potentially what is insulin resistance, and then let's kind of dig in a little bit further from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like that we take a high level view because oftentimes we'll hear people talk about these concepts and they kind of mix them all up, or they kind of put out broad based specifications and they don't really go into the nuances of things. So first, to understand what we're going to be unpacking, which is insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity, we have to know what insulin is as a hormone. So insulin is a regulatory and signaling hormone. It sends out a signal to our cells to consume energy, store any extra energy, and then not let any other energy out. So insulin plays many roles, which is why it's important to monitor and optimize its function. And its main actions include reducing blood sugar, or blood glucose, as many will refer to, inhibiting blood glucose secretion at the liver, so that we're not constantly secreting hepatic glucose, which we're going to get into when it comes to insulin resistance, because that's one of the many contributing factors. And then also include increasing glucose transport into one of three places. So it's either going to go into the muscle tissue, which is what we prefer, the liver, or into adipose tissue, which are our fat cells. So insulin also plays an interesting role, which a lot of people don't realize, in terms of its regulation of hunger. So in those who are insulin sensitive, eating carbs will cause, a rise in blood sugar that results in a regular rise in insulin to meet it, which will tell your body that you're full. However, as we'll unpack later, when you're insulin resistant and you consume carbs, you have a dysregulated insulin response to those carbohydrates and to that blood glucose in your system, which will actually make you want to eat more carbs, which leads us to the topic of insulin resistance. So often when I hear about people talk about insulin resistance, it's kind of reductionistic. They'll automatically put blood glucose and then carbohydrates together, because obviously carbohydrates are the most insulinogenic macronutrient. But that's due to the misunderstanding of insulin resistance at a fundamental level. So insulin resistance is essentially when you have an issue with blood sugar regulation, where you have high circulating levels of blood glucose, which are never getting cleared out. So you constantly have free floating, whether it be fatty acids or blood sugar in the blood. So if someone has insulin resistance and lacks adequate insulin sensitivity, there's a dysfunction at the cells, which are resisting the actions of insulin. And they're not able to properly regulate either our blood sugar levels, which is a major issue because then our body is thrown out of whack. So essentially, our bodies want to maintain balance or homeostasis. And when you have dysregulated blood sugar management, you're unable to do that. So one of the main issues with being insulin resistant is that it's the only hormone that we have to regulate our blood sugar levels. So there's one hormone that regulates blood sugar, but on the other hand, there's many hormones in the body that increase blood sugar, such as cortisol. So we'll always hear that cortisol blood sugar connection, or growth hormone, or glucagon, and then the catecholamines epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are those fight or flight hormones. So these all can raise blood sugar independently or in conjunction with one another. So when things are out of whack and insulin isn't able to do its job, we have a lot of issues because we have so much blood glucose, but we don't have proper insulin signaling to get that blood glucose out of the system and into peripheral tissue, which is the goal.
So kind of to talk about, or just expand a little bit on the end of that, where with the peripheral tissue, where are the two or maybe more main places that we can store that excess blood glucose?
Okay, so in terms of peripheral tissue, we have two storage capacities that are optimal, let's say. So we have muscle glycogen, which stores, on average person, this is the average person that's in a study, 300 to 400 grams of glucose or glycogen, because that's the stored form of glucose. And then in liver, we have about 100 grams of stored glycogen. Now, keep in mind, that's only a total of about 500 grams of carbohydrates or 500 grams of glucose. So really our largest storage capacity is in fat tissue. But that's what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that we have good insulin sensitivity, which will lead to good nutrient partitioning so that we're getting more of the glucose, more of the carbohydrates that we're taking in, more of the energy that we're taking in, and we're shuttling it to the process of rebuilding muscle tissue, storing glycogen for fuel later on for workouts, for your brain, things of that sort. So we want to have both the liver full and then also the muscles full.
And then just a quick kind of aside there. This is a question from me. So I've seen things about that fructose as opposed to glucose, so specifically the type of sugar that is in fruit, gets preferentially stored in the liver as opposed to the muscle tissue. So do you have anything or any insight on that at all?
Yeah, so it does get preferentially stored into just because of the glucose transporters that it uses. So muscle uses what's called GLUT4 translocators that come out of the cell membrane and kind of suck up glucose, whereas fructose doesn't require that same non-insulin mediated action at the cellular membrane. So fructose goes preferentially towards that. So for instance, a big thing is we use the reason that liver glycogen is one of the areas that we really want to store in is because it allows for us to have readily accessible glucose or energy when we're fasted. So for instance, when you're asleep and you have a stress response, like you wake up to an alarm and you get that dumping of cortisol, it's not your muscles that are releasing glucose to cover that, it's your liver. So this is where you want to have, if in a, diet like the ones that I would, kind of the diet model that I follow or I put my clients on, I often put fructose actually in the last meal of the day. So I put a fruit source because it also helps with not only with regulating that blood sugar and getting that liver glycogen stored, but it also helps with sleep quality because you're less likely to wake up from those excursions of cortisol that are going to get you in that adrenaline, dumping state. So it's important to have a mix of both. You don't want to just go with glucose or sucrose. You don't want to just go with one type of carbohydrate. You want to mix things around and also make sure that every tissue or those preferential tissues, both muscle and liver, are filled.
Brandon, I feel like I read a study recently, or maybe it was just a conversation that I heard, but they were talking about how combining fructose and glucose post workout produced better effects than just using glucose.
So actually, it would do it in and of itself without working out. So what happens with working out is, we'll talk about this later, but you get an upregulation in GLUT4. So GLUT4 is that main translocator that's used to suck in glucose into muscle tissue. However, that can happen either insulin mediated, meaning through the intake of carbohydrates and then replenishing muscle glycogen, or it could be non-insulin mediated, which happens when you do muscular contractions, you train. You could do it from doing a post-meal walk. However, when you combine two different sources of carbohydrate, like in the case of a glucose molecule, say like a rice, like my post-workout meal generally is white rice or jasmine rice, and then I'll also do a combination with pineapple, so a fructose source, and also has bromelain, so it's going to help with digestive enzymes and things of that sort. It actually increases the amount of glycogen resynthesis that you can have because there is a cap to the amount of glucose or the amount of glycogen that you can resynthesize in a period of time. So I believe by itself, glucose, so just like a singular carb source, like a sweet potato or like a rice source, would only be about 60 grams per hour that you could readily absorb. But often, like you have a big post-workout meal, it's going to be more than 60 grams of carbohydrates, especially in a surplus. So if you combine some of that, you combine another source of carbohydrates, such as fructose, you'll get an increase in that uptake and that glycogen resynthesis. So people do use it post-workout, generally because that's their largest meal of the day, especially for like us weight trainers that we use more of a peri-workout nutrition type of approach. But you can get that upregulation through actually many capacities. So you can upregulate glycogen resynthesis through combining two different carb sources like glucose and fructose. You can get it by adding sodium. So sodium helps with glucose transport. So it's good that you're increasing your sodium intake because it's going to help with restocking muscle glycogen. You can get it through caffeine as well. And that's the caffeine aspect. The ISSN has put out like a statement that it does do that as of their last update in 2018. But there's some debate over it. Like I've sat down with some of my mentors and they've looked at it and they've seen that it actually downregulates some of glucose resynthesis because of the fact that it turns on the sympathetic nervous system. So when we want to digest and actually absorb carbohydrates, we want to be in that parasympathetic rest and digest state, like we talked about on the last podcast, where I made some suggestions towards digestion and getting into a parasympathetic state to increase absorption. But at least we know that combining two different carb sources as well as adding sodium will help with glycogen resynthesis. So you are right.
Is that last question on that is, so then am I gathering that the most benefit of the fructose would be if you have a post-workout meal that has over 60 grams of carbs in it, then you would need to add the fructose to potentially get more benefit out of that, or it's good no matter what. Like even if you have 30 grams of fructose and 30 grams of glucose, that would be better than 60 grams of glucose.
So I haven't seen. I'll tell you honestly, I haven't seen any studies that have done a comparative study of 60 grams of just glucose compared to 30 and 30. But I have seen things that have shown that adding fructose, even if it's not an equal amount, so a small amount of fructose. So for instance, generally with my clients, I'll use like a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio. So for instance, if someone's having 45 grams or 45 grams of glucose in their post-workout meal, which is 1 cup of rice, I'll utilize, say, a cup of strawberries is a perfect example, 15 grams of carbohydrates. So it's that 3-to-1 ratio. Generally with myself, because I am using a larger carbohydrate meal, I'll do about 100 grams of carbohydrates from rice and then 25 grams of carbohydrates from fruit. So it does still have that absorption. And also keep in mind, like I said, with glucose, our GLUT4 translocation, we have an increase in glycogen resynthesis post-workout anyway. We are our most insulin sensitive post-workout, so you're going to get that advantage anyway. So it's just been shown that it's going to help that absorption. And keep in mind, this is like diving into the minutia for guys like us. You train twice a day, it would be beneficial for you. So when I have MMA athletes or I have competitive bodybuilders that train twice per day, glycogen resynthesis is extremely important post-workout. But if you're someone that trains, say 3 times a week, 4 times a week, you're going to restock muscle glycogen even in a low carbohydrate state within 24 hours. So you don't really have to worry about that. That's why they say the post-workout window is no longer a window. It's like a barn door. So it's a much larger period than we originally thought, where when we started training, they were like, listen, you have to slam a protein shake and a high molecular weight carbohydrate 30 minutes after, or it's a wasted workout.
Right.
We know that that's not the truth anymore. But for high-level athletes, you're training twice a day, I would definitely suggest to try it out.
Okay, last thing on this, and then I'll let us correct course again. Whey protein also spikes insulin, correct?
Yes.
So having a large dose of whey protein and your glucose and your fructose all together is definitely a more beneficial route to take than either just having whey or just having a carb or a specific type of carb.
So reframe that in what you mean. Do you mean, is it going to cause a bigger insulin spike, or is it going to be more conducive to muscle glycogen resynthesis?
The latter.
Okay, because if we were talking about insulin, actually insulin spikes, you max out the amount of endogenous insulin production that you get just from a whey protein shake. Okay. So they've actually, Stu Phillips has done in his lab a study of 25 grams of protein, whey protein, versus 25 grams of carbohydrates, so an equal amount in terms of the caloric density of white bread, and whey protein actually outperformed white bread in terms of its insulinogenic spike because of leucine, because of other amino acids. But if you're talking about glycogen resynthesis, there is a ceiling. Adding protein to a carbohydrate source is not going to maximize it, but adding protein in what they would call like a protein preload, so eating a protein shake before you eat the meal, will help with glycemic variability, which is essentially how our blood glucose gets regulated after a meal. So you get a large spike, but you come back down to that normal level that you want to be in just for general health. So you'll get that glycogen resynthesis benefit, but you won't have like these, what we would call hyperinsulinemic levels, which is what would lead to, over time, to insulin resistance.
Got it. Okay, cool. We can totally correct course now and get back on.
Yeah, but no, those are great questions, Bryan, and the applicability is perfect there.
Cool.
Okay, so moving on a little bit. So kind of steering the ship back towards insulin resistance, because we want to frame this up and make sure people understand it. What types of things in your life or lifestyle can lead to insulin resistance? So if we had to break it down to also include some things or potential aspects around genetics, we'd like to hit on there. And then how important would, say, lifestyle or genetics be in your desired outcome?
Okay, so first thing I want to clarify for the audience, because this is something that I see very common, but if you were to dig into the research, you would see that this is actually like more of a myth. We know there's so many misconceptions within fitness. So many make the assumption that insulin resistance is a glucose-centric condition, purely caused by excessive intake of carbohydrates, or most notably sugar. But actually it's from an excessive intake of energy of either substrate, whether that be carbohydrates or fat, or a combination of the two. So the number one underlying factor for insulin resistance is actually being in a caloric surplus. So, when you're taking in an excessive amount of energy, aka overeating, like calories day in and day out, that leads to a dysregulation in blood sugar management and a lowering of insulin sensitivity. So I see this a lot in lifestyle clients that come to me who spent years eating like the standard American diet. So it's not that their carbohydrate intake is that high, it's that they're eating a lot of refined sugars, they're eating, trans fats, things like that, just, very poor sources of food, more of hyperpalatable, highly processed, refined foods, so they're over consuming calories, yet they're under consuming micronutrients. So that's usually the state that I see people in, which compounds the issue because they don't have the necessary cofactors and the electrolytes and other minerals that are necessary to actually transport glucose, but they're also taking in an enormous amount of calories that are suboptimal for where they're at. And then also we can extrapolate this to fitness. I see this often. I get a lot of guys, I train a lot of competitive athletes as well as competitive bodybuilders or physique athletes, bikini competitors, and a lot of those who take that aggressive approach to bulking where they push a massive surplus actually come to me insulin resistant. So they look metabolically healthy from the outside. You would see them, I'm not saying, shredded or lean, but they're in good shape. They're metabolically active. They're weight training. They're guys like us, however, due to their lifestyle and due to the excessive amount of calories over a prolonged period of time, they're actually insulin resistant. So, this can happen from the standard American diet or just from being in a caloric surplus for a prolonged period of time. So I often see this most times in like natural athletes who take years off between the stage where they do those like excessive bulks to get 30 or 40 pounds over. And even if they see some sort of conditioning where they have abs, they're seeing some, it's not like they're seeing a massive increase in adiposity or body fat. It's that compounding issue. Blood sugar is constantly elevated. They're constantly eating. These are the guys that think they have to eat 6 to 7 times a day, that they have to push high carb meals. So what they don't realize is that you can't be in a surplus at all times. You can't be thinking that you're going to gain muscle and stimulate mTOR at all times of the year. And what I often find them doing is that they don't use nutritional periodization. So they don't incorporate, phases out of a surplus like a mini cut or a maintenance phase or even like a health or cleanup phase, which I'm a very big proponent of. And so when we get back down to diet, too much of any macronutrient or too much of anything is not good for you. So for instance, if you're someone who has an excessive carb intake, it can cause hyperinsulinemia, which causes your body to constantly secrete a high amount of insulin, which decreases insulin sensitivity. Then on the other hand, if you're someone that has like an excessively high fat intake, like those that utilize keto or carnivore or one of those approaches that are very predominant, especially in saturated fats, because we do have studies that even in the absence of a surplus, even at maintenance calories, saturated fat can cause insulin resistance, which is super interesting to me. But if you have an excessive fat intake, it puts you in a state where you have high circulating levels of fatty acids, which actually shut off some of the signaling that allows for the transport of glucose into the cell. So besides the nutritional components, that's only one thing. So that is the number one underlying factor. However, when we look at other things, there's so many other things besides nutrition that impacts whether you're going to be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And that's what I really hone in on. I get the nutrition right with my clients, but then I have to be pulling back the layers of the onion, as I say. So high levels of stress that are not accompanied by stress management, a huge reason. So another big thing that I see is people that are sympathetic dominant. So this could be, these are essentially individuals that have high blood sugar levels in the morning and then throughout the day as they're constantly in this fight or flight state, which has their bodies constantly releasing cortisol, which then dysregulates blood sugar production. So I see this in lean individuals who suffer from insulin resistance as they may not be losing insulin sensitivity due to an excessive energy intake, but could be losing it due to excessive amounts of chronic stress. And this causes what I always phrase as artificially elevated blood sugar levels. So this is where I have someone like a physique athlete, or I have a CrossFit competitor, or I have, an MMA fighter, someone that's chronically stressed, but they don't realize it because their actual stress is their training. They're going through high workloads. Their body's put under excessive demand. Or on the opposite side, this is where I see lifestyle clients that are CEOs of businesses and they're constantly under, stress and they don't realize it. Their ability to perceive stress is much different than ours. They're so used to this excessive workload that they don't understand that they're dealing with a lot. So that's one thing. It's not only stress like for those that actually feel it and perceive it, it's also for those that are constantly on the go. They're like those type A personalities. And I actually suffered for this for years until I learned how to manage my blood glucose better, because I am that person that's constantly on the run and constantly, rushing and having these deadlines and things of that sort. And then the other thing that a lot of people overlook, and this is in fitness in general, and I'm sure you guys see this, is poor sleep quality and duration. We have studies that have shown that after just 5 nights of sleep restriction, in healthy males, their blood sugar levels were that of a diabetic. So in the particular study that I'm referring to, they saw a 28.8% increase in insulin output, as well as an 11.4% increase in mean glucose values. That means throughout the entirety of the day, the 24-hour period following that sleep restriction, they had dysregulated blood sugar. So it's not just in the morning. Like often, we'll get into how I track this with my clients, but I'll see someone that suffers from like dawn phenomenon, or I'll see someone that suffers from elevated blood glucose levels after one night of bad sleep, and we'll chuck it up to something else. but I also had them do postprandial readings because I want to see, did that just transiently or temporarily impact your blood glucose, or did that cause you to have dysregulated blood sugar for days on end? And then the last component, which actually surprisingly, and this is something that's kind of a hobby horse for myself, because as like I've shared with you guys, my dad died of diabetic complications. So he had metabolic syndrome, and the two most predominating factors as to why he passed away last year was due to diabetes as well as cardiovascular disease, so heart failure. And the thing with that is that this is something that's very close to my heart, which is why I'm passionate about this subject and why, we'll talk about my own habits within managing blood glucose as well as tracking blood glucose with my glucometer every day. But genetics do play a role. So having a family history of diabetes does lead you to having a higher predisposition to developing diabetes. However, it's actually your lifestyle plays more of a predominating factor. So for instance, we actually see that right now, 50% of the US population as of 2018 was considered pre-diabetic. But if we look at the actual standard mean of that and look at how many people are actually diabetic within their family, it's a much smaller percentile. So we can't put it on genetics. There is this nature versus nurture, and it's oftentimes it's this state where what we're doing is more impactful, or even what we're not doing, and that's what's leading to insulin resistance. So really what I want to get out of this, and what I want people to realize, is that insulin resistance is essentially the result of trying to shove excess energy into the cell, which you can't hold anymore. So this is why fat accumulates, as it's trying to store energy and protect us. And once you try to shove more energy into the cell than it has the capacity to hold, you're going to increase oxidative stress and inflammation, which are the other two leading causes of insulin resistance. So people don't, they're always, in fitness especially, we like to put things in silos. We want to say nutrition is in one corner and training is in one corner and stress is in the other corner. And we extrapolate these things and we don't realize that everything is tied together from, pretty much like the ground up. And everything that you do within your lifestyle, it's not just the hour that you're training in the gym. It's not just the few hours that you're cooking in the kitchen and eating your meals. It's the 24 hours of what you're doing, the decisions you're making, the perceptions of what's going on around you. There's so many other inputs within your life that contribute to insulin resistance or your level of insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, I really love everything you really just went on. And what I kind of wanted to say is, especially when you were talking about like that athlete who is like might be lean or these other things, in like late 2017, that's where I found myself. I was in like my powerlifting phase. I was really, big for me. I was 227 pounds at 5'11". That's literally 27 more pounds than I have on me right now. It was the biggest I'd ever been in my life. And I wasn't like super lean. I was probably 16, maybe 17% body fat. And then when I started learning about this stuff, I was like, oh man, I wonder where mine are at. So I ordered a Care Touch off of Amazon, and I was like 117, 119, and I was like, oh shit, this is bad. And it was just really interesting. And I wasn't even eating that many carbohydrates at the time, maybe 350, 400.
And that's not a lot for your size, and that's why I try to bring it home. The number one root cause is excess calorie intake, but it's not always that. Stress plays just as equal of a role. It's just not as commonly thought of.
And that's exactly what I was going to get into. I was training like a high frequency of a high intensity training modality. I still had my tech job in the software industry, which was stressful. I was a very poor sleeper. That was something that took me years to kind of get around. And what was really interesting is even as I lost all that weight, I got like shredded, like definitely like 9-10% body fat, and the levels didn't change much. I was still pulling 112s, 115s, and it was because of the other aspects in my life. The dieting eventually added stress into my life. The training frequency was still high. My sleep was still poor, and all these other things. So it's much more than just the diet. So I really love how you frame that up, because I was that person. And I know there's people out there listening to this episode who are that person and think like, oh, my carbs aren't super high or whatever. I'm not overweight. But there's so many more moving pieces to it than just that.
That's the huge thing, and that's why I really try to educate both my clientele and then other people about, yes, body fat is a major contributing factor because it's a sign that you're in a calorie surplus, but there are lean individuals. I'll tell you guys, I've prepped competitors since 2012, so it's been a long period of time, and I'm saying predominantly most of them are insulin sensitive. You're at a low level of body fat, you have low carbohydrate, low calorie intake in general, you're doing a lot of aerobic work, doing a lot of training, but I have those rare individuals, maybe 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 guys, and females especially, that they end up having insulin resistance, even at a low level of body fat that you would never expect. You would look at them from the outside and everyone would think, man, you're healthy. And they would make the same assumption. But this is why I track, which we'll go into later, all these other biomarkers, because there's always more than meets the eye, and the scale as well as the mirror can only show you so much.
Yeah, agreed. So kind of keep us moving along here. What are, I know, and you just kind of briefly covered this, but I want to make sure we kind of really hit home with this for the listeners. What are like the different types of insulin resistance that we might experience, and then what tissues specifically do they occur in?
Okay, so there are several forms of insulin resistance that we see. So the first one that's most predominantly and that people think of when they think insulin resistance is insulin resistance at the level of the pancreas. And this is a condition where there's too much glucose in the blood and the beta cells of the pancreas can't keep up and produce enough insulin to clear it out. So that's why we have those high levels of circulating blood glucose. Now, on the other side, as that gets worse and worse, we start seeing insulin resistance at the cellular level. And this is where our cells are unable to uptake and store any additional nutrients due to being filled to their full storage capacity. So this is a situation where you'll be insulin resistant at the level of the muscle, the liver, the brain. And then you'll start partitioning most of the extra glucose as well as energy into adipose tissue, which has a much larger storage capacity than our glycogen storage. So like I hit on before, glycogen storage might max out at 500 grams per day between the liver and muscle. Your fat has almost unlimited sources. And even if it's not sub-Q fat, that's where we move to visceral fat. And that's where, we start getting fat around the organs. And that's one of the leading causes of insulin resistance as well. But it's harder to track because a lot of people, they're not going to go get ultrasounds and they're not going to notice it because it's not visible body fat. When I say subcutaneous body fat, that's a fat that jiggles. That, it's unsightly, but it's not as unhealthy for you. Whereas visceral fat is extremely deleterious to your health. So, once that happens, we start filling up fat cells, especially in the adipose tissue of the subcutaneous stores, we cause fat cell hyperplasia, which is the growth of new adipocytes or fat cells. So this is dangerous. Like, people don't realize this. You cannot lose fat cells. You can shrink them. So if you go into a dieting phase, you will shrink your fat cells. It's almost like a sponge. I try to explain it to my clients like, you have a sponge and say it's full, it's wrung up with water, and you wring it out completely. You completely get every ounce of water. At that point, that's your fat cell when it's depleted of fat. So when you're at your leanest state. Well then, before when it was full, you could not get any more water from the table or from the bucket. But if it's completely wrung out and dry, you can soak up a bunch of new fat or more water. So that's what happens with fat cells, but it only has so much. It's a storage capacity. So from there, it starts expanding and needing other sponges. So once that happens, we cannot lose fat cells, but research has showed that we can gain fat cells. And even if we can lose fat cells, because there are some, rat models that look at this, it's like every 10 years you could lose fat cells. So if you go through a dieting phase and you rebound really harshly and you go through what's called body fat overshooting, where you actually get into these hyperphagic, which means extreme hunger and overeating phase, that you regain all this weight like we see with a lot of dieters. It's that yo-yo dieter. They actually gain more fat than they lost to begin with, and they're creating new fat cells in the process, which they cannot lose thereafter. So this is a problem that, leads to insulin resistance. And, this is where we get people to where they seem to get a point in like their off season or, a gaining phase where they start looking softer with like every pound they gain, and as though they're gaining pure body fat, which in actuality they are. And a lot of times people contribute this. They'll say, oh, it's water. I'm eating a lot of carbs, so I'm holding a lot of water. But it's actually that you're starting to increase fat cell storage, and that's going to lead you to insulin resistance as if it hasn't already.
Yeah, I just a quick kind of aside. I hit a point with my last gaining phase where like I was looking great, and then like literally like 2 weeks went by, and I was like, "Hey Jason, I'm not sure." And he was like, "Yep, you're right. We hit it. It's time. It's time to go the opposite direction." And it was wild. It was literally like a 2.5, 3 week period. Weight only changed maybe 2 pounds, and it was like, "Yep, we don't look so hot anymore."
But your partitioning went in the opposite direction. So you were positively partitioning into muscle, into liver, and then realize, like I said, those storage capacities aren't that large. So if it's 400 grams for muscle glycogen and it's 100 grams for liver, that's 500 grams. That doesn't mean you can only consume 500 grams of carbohydrates, because we're going to burn glucose especially with intense training. But if every day you're topping off those stores, eventually you're going to burn less, because think about it, you're not in energy balance, you're in a surplus, so you're consuming more than you're burning. So it only makes theoretical sense and logical sense that you're consuming more glucose than you're expending, and that's where you start storing in other tissues, because there's no more room in muscle. You're full to the brim, and that's where we'll go on to some of the side effects, but this is where I see a lot of my clients say, I'm not getting pumps anymore, I'm eating a high carbohydrate diet. And that's where it's one of the warnings that we'll go over, that I'm like, we got to pull this back.
Yep. Go ahead, Bryan.
Yeah, so it's obviously it's difficult to tell, I guess, when you're gaining weight, like how much of it is coming from increase in adipose tissue and how much is water retention. Like you kind of said, like you look at it visually, maybe as you said, you kind of had that conversation with Aaron. You said with your coach, kind of figure that out. But ultimately, I think the biggest issue of gaining body fat is that it's going to potentially impact, or the belief was that it would impact the P ratio, but we seem to have this new research that it doesn't really impact the P ratio. So, what are kind of the consequences on our physique and strength goals, and the drawbacks to being insulin resistant as we kind of continue to gain weight as we pursue strength and physique?
Yeah, so oftentimes we'll look at the physique consequences of it. So you're gaining body fat, it's unsightly, things of that sort. But I always try to bring it back to health because I have a statement that I make with all my clients, and it's a healthy body is a responsive body. So we have to realize that insulin resistance is a major underlying cause and contributing factor to many chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and high blood pressure. So it also increases systemic inflammation. And so with those constructs or with those issues come downstream effects on your muscle building capability. So if you're chronically inflamed, you're not going to be able to recover. It's going to limit recovery. It's going to limit workout intensity if you're in a state where you have high blood pressure, because we know training increases blood pressure. But if you're already topped off in terms of blood pressure because you're in this metabolically resistant or insulin resistant state, you're going to be unable to train as hard. You're going to be unable to utilize nutrients as positively. And when we go back to the P ratio, yes, Greg Nuckols and Eric Trexler did great research upon that, but we're seeing that in metabolically active individuals. So they're saying, all right, you can get to a higher body fat percentage than we thought if you're active. So they're looking at sumo wrestlers, they're looking at college football players. But if you actually look at the study that Eric cited in that, he's been going back and forth, 50% of those 19-year-olds in that study were actually insulin resistant. So yes, 50% of them weren't insulin resistant, but the other half was. So it's like, we can't just, and I'm not saying that he's cherry picking research because he's an incredible researcher. However, we have to look at the full picture. So just because it only affects half of the population doesn't mean it's not negatively or deleteriously affecting the others. And we also have to realize that what our goal should be is to be metabolically flexible, meaning the ability to switch between substrates. We want to be able to use carbohydrates for energy when there is, an intensive activity, a glycolytic activity like weight training, or we're doing HIIT sprints, or we're doing a Metcon. And then we want to be able to easily switch to a fuel substrate like fat when we're doing low intensity activity or when we're fasting. And what ends up happening is if you're insulin resistant and you're an athlete or you're a trained individual, you're going to be unable to switch between those fuel sources, and you're not going to be able to use either one of those readily, or you're not going to be able to use them optimally. So you're going to be unable to increase muscle tissue. You're going to be unable to tap into glycogen storage and be able to fuel your workouts and fuel recovery and resynthesize muscle glycogen so that you had that recovery effect after. So there's so many effects on that, cellular level, but then also it limits the amount of time that we could stay in a surplus. So if your goal is muscle building, you need to be in some type of a surplus. You can be at maintenance calories, but most adequately a few hundred calories over would be the most optimal scenario, especially for a natural athlete. You want to leverage the most anabolic thing you have, which is food. However, if you're insulin resistant, your body's not going to have that readily accessible or accessibility to utilize those calories in an optimal way, because it's just going to go to fat storage. So it's like, if you really want to have a long career in terms of training, in terms of actually gaining muscle, in terms of fueling performance, you want to be insulin sensitive, because that's going to put you in the most optimal state for health, for performance, and for physique outcomes.
I have two kind of potential ways in which maybe general population could look at this subjectively. So you mentioned that, when you're insulin resistant, you might have, despite eating carbs, you might have trouble getting a pump in the gym, right? Mm-hmm. So we also hear all the time about people that, work a day job and it's 12:30 and they go out to lunch with the crew and they have like a big carb heavy lunch, and then they come home and they have food coma. So is this a sign of being insulin resistant? And should the person that eats the high carb sources, should this person receive energy from these versus feeling depleted and low energy? Or is what we're seeing potentially the crash that comes, later on from eating these carbs as they turn to sugar? Or what can we make of this?
So I can't speak in generalities because it does differ from individual to individual.
Yeah.
So if you had someone that was insulin resistant, they would be unable to uptake whether it be glucose or fat substrate. So in either case, whether it be a high carb meal or it be a high fat meal, they would have an inability to partition those properly. So in either case, they would not derive the energy that you would get from that meal. So the reason I'm trying to separate it a little bit, because everyone goes to the high carb example and they always go, well, I feel tired or sluggish after carbs. Sometimes that's from serotonin production, but if you're insulin resistant and you're taking a huge high carb meal, you are likely to feel foggy. You are likely to feel like a dip in energy. And then also we have to realize that with insulin resistance comes imbalances in blood sugar. So you're getting highs and lows. You have rises and dips in insulin, which are inconsistent in terms of the way that our patterning should be. So in either case, those are the type of people that do see diminished, energy. These are also the perfect example of this is someone that can't go a long period of time without eating. Generally, they're insulin resistant. So if someone, wakes up in the morning and they automatically feel hangry, and it's only been, say, an 8-hour fast that they've been sleeping, and they feel like they can't go without it. And it's not just a psychological thing, because we do know there is research that's been done on the placebo boosting effects of eating a breakfast before a training session.
Right.
But if it's not that condition, say it's someone that, they don't have a training day, they're not, super active. This is usually in like inactive populations or in some, lifestyle clients where you have them that they tell you, I can't go without breakfast, or I can't go without a meal every 2 hours, or I need a snack every hour. That's dysregulated blood sugar. So that's a sign that they're leading their way into insulin resistance. Doesn't mean that they are, but they're going into those, they're trying to compensate for those blood sugar swings. So really what's happening is they take in a carbohydrate meal per se, and their body overcompensates with insulin because there's high circulating glucose levels. So then all of a sudden they have too much insulin, it starts bringing it down, and it's partitioning and shuttling that into fat tissue. Then all of a sudden they get blood sugar low because they had so much insulin secretion that actually brought them down to a low, so they feel hypoglycemic. And then they feel that they have to eat to raise their blood sugar again. And it's like a vicious cycle that people go through. And that's usually before becoming full-blown insulin resistant, but it's leading towards there, because think about it. Now a person that might have eaten 3 meals a day is eating 3 meals a day and 3 snacks. And all of a sudden they went from being at maintenance calories to being in excess of energy, in a surplus. So it's like these compounding factors. But what I always try to get, to my clients or to other individuals, it's never just one thing. It's a combination of many.
I think about myself when I ask that question, kind of, because on days that I don't work out, off days, I tend to fast in the morning, and I don't do that on days that I train. But I always feel like so good during the time that I'm fasting, right? All the things that people say. And then, 12, 1 or 2 p.m. hits, and I have my first meal for the day. And I am always just dead tired within like 20 minutes of having that meal. I'm like on the couch and I just need to kind of like close my eyes and take like 10 minutes. So I was just thinking about that, but it seems like, what's the rationale for that, I guess, would be my question.
So, like I said, that would be individual to you. So, we discussed earlier in the podcast, your blood sugar is in a good range. So it's not like you would be insulin resistant. It could be an issue with metabolic flexibility, your ability to, switch between fuel substrates. In the morning, you're readily accessing, fats for energy. So you're running off ketones, you feel good, you feel clear-headed. I do a very similar thing. I utilize at least a 16-hour fast on off days. And I'll tell you, I don't do it for all the autophagy benefits that people proclaim that we know doesn't exist in that short of a time period. I do it for productivity. It allows me, I'm up at 3:30, 4 o'clock every morning. So I fast from, the night before, but I'm generally not eating a meal till 12 or 1 o'clock. So that's 8 or 9 hours of productivity. But when I do have a meal, I feel great. But it's also, it could be the composition of the meal. It could be how many calories you're taking in. So generally when I have someone do an intermittent fast, I don't have them do like a huge meal immediately upon first thing, because then they are going to get a dip. They just went from a high to a low, So it's like you just had all this energy, you don't have anything in your system. And then it's not only what's in the meal. So it is about composition, it is about calories, but it's also about your reaction, your body's response to those nutrients, because all of a sudden your body went from a state of not digesting nutrients for 16 or 20 hours. You took all the burden off. And then now, if you were to consume, so for instance, what I see with a lot of people that do intermittent fasting is they eat much larger meals than they would in the confines of a regular day. So for instance, if I eat 3,000 calories a day spread over 5 meals, that's 600 calories per meal. But all of a sudden, if I bring that down and I say I'm going to eat 3 meals a day within my fast, all of a sudden a 600 calorie meal became a 1,000 calorie meal. And my body, first of all, from a regulatory standpoint, it's not used to digesting that amount of nutrients in one sitting. And also it's out of my circadian pattern. So it's off a different meal frequency. It's off a different meal amount. So it's really about synchronizing the body with circadian biology, with chrononutrition, and then doing it for the individual. So that's where, Brad, like I would suggest change the meal composition.
No, it's the size of the meal. You nailed it. It's the size of the meal, because I always had this rationale that, I haven't eaten for 18 or 20 hours or whatever it is, and I should probably get MPS spiked as big as I can. I should get some glycogen flowing through there. Like I should start this process of getting food back in my body. So I probably do have 1,000, 1,200 calories when I haven't eaten for almost an entire 24-hour period. So that's really yeah.
That's where I would tell you, try that on a training day and just, reallocate or redistribute your calories to just have one meal throughout that day, maybe the same time period. So for instance, say that you utilize an intermittent fast on off days and you only eat 3 meals. Let's use hypotheticals. Mm-hmm. But on regular days you eat 5 meals. We'll take and allocate the same amount of calories towards a meal at the same time, even on a training day, and see how you feel, to see if it is the calorie allocation. It is the fact that, you're having this bolus that your body now has to work even harder to break down, utilize, and absorb. Because often that's what I find. I find that, and the reason I'm going back to this is because I'll have a lot of busy clients that I might have them on 4 meals a day, but sometimes they get really busy in between meetings or work, and they'll compound meals, meaning they'll put them together. And then all of a sudden they tell me that they didn't feel well, or they were suffering digestively, or that they had lack of energy. And those 4 meals, those same meals, in a regular day, they feel fine when they're utilizing 4 hours apart in terms of meal timing. But when they compound those 2 last meals of the day into one, all of a sudden it hits them like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, for sure. On training days, I don't really even have any large servings of food at all until dinner. It's just kind of small boluses every 2 or 3 hours. So it's a very different approach that I take than on the non-training day. So that's a good point. I'm glad we had that discussion, that part of it.
Do you guys want to get back on track to move on?
Yeah. Run with it, Aaron.
Cool. So, I think we've established at this point that insulin resistance is something that we really do not want in our physiology, really. So the opposite of that would then be something called a term insulin sensitivity, which would be beneficial. So what are some of the benefits that we would get from being insulin sensitive, and how can this benefit kind of our pursuit of, more muscle mass, decreased fat loss, and a better body composition?
Okay, so insulin sensitivity in and of itself refers to your body's ability to appropriately react to increases in glucose by secreting appropriate amounts and levels of insulin that will increase and enhance the uptake of glucose and normalize blood sugar. So it's literally the exact opposite. Now you're readily utilizing, you're storing it in muscle cells and liver cells. We're having it go where we want it to go. And the reason why being insulin sensitive is so important, besides the health effects, is that it helps with burning fat better. It helps with building muscle more efficiently. It helps with staying leaner, and then also all those health effects from maintaining cardiovascular health, which is going to help with aerobic capacity, training intensity, recovery capacity. It's going to help you, utilize different fuel substrates. So, like I was talking about with metabolic flexibility, you'll see that individuals that are more insulin sensitive, they're having less blood sugar highs and lows. They're feeling better throughout the day. They're able to function cognitively, whether they have food or they don't have food. So it's enhancing every aspect. You're more focused in your training. You're more focused at work. You're healthier. You're leaner. You're partitioning nutrients better. You're getting better pumps in the gym. So there are all these benefits to being insulin sensitive as compared to being insulin resistant.
Awesome. So, this is something, again, following back to what I said about myself a handful of years ago, it's something I found to be completely true now. As some of the offline conversations you and I have had, Brandon, over the past month or so, it's something that I've recently started paying a lot more attention to. And again, my numbers are some of the best they've ever been, even though I'm just coming off this very high period, and a lot of it is those other kind of things. And it just gives you a lot more flexibility in how resistant I don't want to use resistant in terms of
no, but you're using resiliency.
But yeah, you're resistant in your resiliency. Yeah, that's a term I was looking for. So it is one of those things that just kind of the better, the longer you do it, right? Generally with everything, the better you get at it, the more beneficial it becomes.
No, absolutely. So you guys want to dive into how we check if we're insulin sensitive or resistant? Because that's a huge thing. We'll talk about these different things, but I really try to bring things back all the time. There are subjective markers, some of which we've covered, but there are objective markers. And here's the whole thing. I'm very into tracking and managing. I'm very into the statement of you can't manage what you don't measure. And there are objective measurements that we could use. So I like using a combination of the two because in a lot of cases, some people will ignore side effects or they'll ignore subjective markers, or sometimes they're just not honest about what they're feeling. And so that's where I get something that's more objective, it's numerical, it's quantitative rather than qualitative, and I'm able to see certain things. So the first thing that I utilize, and this is kind of a hobby horse of mine, I know Bryan's asked me about it before, is I use fasted blood glucose levels. And I use blood glucose levels in general, but the first thing I start with is fasted blood glucose levels as the first marker for insulin sensitivity and nutrient partitioning. And the reason I do that is it's non-invasive, it's easy to do, and it's cheap. You can literally grab a glucometer for $10 or $15 at your pharmacy or your Walmart or your local supermarket, and be able to do that on a daily basis. And it's something that allows me to gauge how a client is responding to their nutrition plan and their macronutrient setup. Because like I said, everyone's going to respond to different macronutrients differently, and especially when they're in a calorie surplus. So this is a phase of training that's like a non-negotiable for me. If someone's in an excessive surplus, we're really pushing calories, we're trying to grow muscle, I don't want to just see your pictures. Like, that's great. I could see most of the accumulation of body fat and how muscle is being put on, but we know that muscle is a very time-intensive process, so it takes a long period of time. However, we know from the opposite side of the spectrum, fat loss is super quick, but so is fat gain. But sometimes it creeps up on you and you don't notice it as much, especially when it's something like a photo. Checking photo, lighting can be different. They could have a pump at the gym. There's so many factors that kind of deviate, and also someone's, whether it be their body fat set point or settling point where they kind of hold around, also what their fat cell distribution is. So some people hold it in different areas that I might not see on a check-in. So it's very important to get more of an objective reading, which is why I go for blood glucose. So when it comes to fasted blood glucose, what I'm looking for is a value between 70 and 85 milligrams per deciliter, which has been shown to be in the healthy range. Now, the issue here, at least in the States, and this is where most of our audience is anyway, is that blood sugar readings on blood work are labeled quote unquote normal within 65 to 99. So for instance, if you got your labs done and you had a 97 on your fasted blood glucose reading, you'd be labeled as normal. Your doctor wouldn't say anything to you. They probably wouldn't even comment on it. It would be in range on your blood work. There would be no parameter. It wouldn't say you're high, nothing. Yet we have studies that for every milligram per deciliter of fasted blood glucose that you're over 85 milligrams per deciliter. So if you notice, I said the optimal 70 to 85. Every milligram over 85 milligrams per deciliter, your chance of developing diabetes goes up 6%. So if you're at that 97, you just took 6% and multiplied it by 12. So that's 72% higher. So that's something to be alarmed about. So then in terms of, other BG readings, like say if you were 100 or over, 100 milligrams per deciliter over, you'd be labeled pre-diabetic. And then if you were 126 milligrams per deciliter or over, you'd be labeled as diabetic. Now, here's the thing with that. In the US, you have to go for 2 fasted blood glucose readings and hit those values to be labeled as either one of those. So for instance, the average person that I know goes for blood work maybe once a year. So it could be 2 years before you get a diagnosis. And here's the thing with what I do with my own clients is I have them go for blood work at least every 3 to 6 months. And if I see someone's edging towards that, that's where I just take out the glucometer and we do it at home, because then I can get a consistent value. And so with my blood glucose tracking for myself and with clients, I like to do more of a running average. And the reason I do that is we'll talk later on, and we did talk a little bit about stress and sleep and the impacts that they have on insulin resistance. But if we only look at one marker in time, if we only take one fasted blood glucose reading a week, we're not considering all the other impacts. That's just not just a reading of insulin sensitivity in the moment. So for instance, I've had clients that have come to me and the first reading that they ever send me on a weekly check-in is a 97 or a 99 or over 100. And if I took that, and I kind of just went right on there, I would say they're insulin resistant or they're pre-diabetic. Now, here's the thing. They could have had a bad night of sleep the night before, which we've seen in studies to raise that about 10 milligrams per deciliter. Mm-hmm. So a 97 could really be an 87. So they could be right in that healthy range, but it could be skewed from sleep. It could be skewed from stress. They could have had, a very stressful morning where they got an adrenal dump, a cortisol dump, which increased their blood sugar levels and increased that blood glucose reading. So there's so many factors, which is why I do the same thing with blood glucose that I do with weight. So when I do scale weight, we all know that there's so many fluctuations. There's food volume, there's hydration levels, there's the amount of urination or pee that you did overnight, there's sodium intake, and then there's just daily stressors, cortisol, water retention, all these things that impact scale weight. So I like doing things in a 7-day daily or weekly average where I get more of a mean value. So for instance, I'll tell you guys personally, I've been tracking my blood glucose every day for years. And this really comes back to the fact, like I said, I lost my father to diabetes. So it's something, and it's really prevalent in my family. So it's something I'm always on top of. And I want to stay on top of it because it does change during periods of time. And the issue with doing blood work like doctors do is if you're only going once a year, you're only getting fasted blood glucose once a year. And if you're not checking it at home, you're only getting HbA1c, which is a 3-month marker, which we'll cover next, once per year. So you're not seeing the fluctuations week to week, month to month. So for me, I do it every single day. And for instance, last night I didn't get any sleep. I'm sure you guys realize because I messaged you at like 4 a.m. in the morning. But I had a 94 this morning. Now, 94 is quite high for me. But like I told you guys, my weekly average was 88. So even though that 94, brought it up substantially, the average is still within that range. So that's why I want to get averages. And then from there, I don't always do it daily with clients. Maybe I'll do it 3 times a week, but I do want one day where it's a stressful work day. So for instance, a Monday, I always like getting a Monday reading because that is shown to be the most stressful day in the work week. I like getting at least a day off of training. So after a day off of training to see a little bit lower stress response. And then I also like a weekend where they sleep in a little bit. So they got better sleep quality. So it kind of averages into what would be their like mean average. So from there, the next marker that I look at to test insulin sensitivity is HbA1c. So this is your reading of blood glucose averages over 3 months. So essentially HbA1c, what that refers to is how much glucose has attached itself to hemoglobin in your blood, which indicates a glycation reaction. So for me, my standard value that I'm looking for is between 5 and 5.2. But when you look at the American standard, and I have to explain this every time I get on a podcast about blood work, is when we look at the standard reference ranges, this is a mean average, meaning that it's 2 standard deviations away from the mean, which encompasses 95% of the population. Now with that, we're taking from a sick population. So for instance, like I said, 50% of Americans are pre-diabetic. So if you went to the reference range and you said, all right, well 99 is normal, you have to realize that 50% of people are above that normal in day-to-day life. So they're taking from a sick population, which is what brought that average to 99 rather than 85, which is actually what's shown in the research as being more optimal. So when it comes to HbA1c, the value that the US indicates as like a danger zone for being pre-diabetic is 5.7 to 6.4. So like I said, my value, 5 to 5.2. The pre-diabetic level is 5.7 to 6.4. And then if you were to do 2 blood tests over 6.5 on your HbA1c, you'd be labeled as a diabetic. And then there's 2 other ones that are a little bit less commonly used, but I do like getting them if a client comes back and, first of all, I'm seeing fasted glucose readings being high. I'm seeing their postprandial, which would be a reading 2 to 3 hours after their meals. So for instance, I have some clients that have dawn phenomenon, which is essentially they have an adrenaline, release, essentially like a stress response in the morning, which causes increases in blood glucose just in that fasted state. And that really comes from like a cortisol release. We have a cortisol awakening response, which is completely normal. If we didn't have a cortisol response in the morning, we wouldn't wake up, and be able to be productive. It's just liberating energy. So it's completely normal. So that's where if I see someone's going over that 95, 100 milligrams per deciliter value consistently, I'm like, all right, after your biggest carb meal, let's do a reading 2.5 hours after. Let's see what range it's in. And then I'll also do them after another meal, like their first meal of the day, like their breakfast. And so if I see that something's off within both fasted blood glucose, their postprandial blood glucose, and then HbA1c is where I'll go to markers like fasted insulin and then also an oral glucose tolerance test. So with fasted insulin, the range is between, it's really wide. It's 2.6 to 24.9. Now that is enormous, guys. And like I said, it's based on the population average, and we have a sick population that is pre-diabetic. And that is, so mind you, pre-diabetic means that you're already well into being insulin resistant. So if 50% of our population is pre-diabetic, that means that probably there's estimates that between 84 and 90% of our US population is metabolically dysfunctional, meaning that they would have insulin resistance. So they're not pre-diabetic and they're not diabetic, but they're insulin resistant. So the reason I don't use that range is because it's not showing me what I want with the people that I work with. I don't want normal. I don't want, average, quote unquote. I want optimal. I want better, and I want healthy. So I look between having them between a 2 and a 4, whereas, that range is, 22 points up across. And then the next thing that I'll do is if I still see things off is we'll do an oral glucose tolerance test. So this is where they give you like a 75 gram glucose solution. and then test your blood sugar 2 hours after. So it's the same concept as I would do with postprandial, but they actually do it in the lab. And then what they show is if you're over 140 milligrams after those 2 hours, your blood sugar has not come down, you're labeled pre-diabetic, and then I believe it's over 160 or 180, I forget which value, is your diabetic.
I think it's 160. I don't remember perfectly, but yeah.
So from there, those are the objective markers I'm looking at. I'm looking at those things that I'm saying, all right, do these add up to someone being insulin resistant? And generally, I'm already approaching things with certain, approaches to mitigate. So if I see someone's, fasted blood glucose and their postprandials are off, I'm already implementing certain tactics that we'll cover later on to improve insulin sensitivity. But when I get to blood work, if that is still going on, I'm also checking other subjective markers, because this is a big indication of, whether what I'm seeing in the blood work is matching the symptoms. So that's where I'm trying to ask more questions. So generally, like what we'll notice from subjective markers is that they're gaining excess body fat. So when insulin sensitivity lowers, your body stops partitioning nutrients properly and is more likely to store extra calories as fat. Hence why you start accumulating extra body fat, even if your calories are around the same as they previously were. So this is where we see, like Aaron was talking about, all of a sudden within like a 2.5 week period, he started noticing like, wow, my physique's looking off, like, things are looking a little bit off. I need to pull things back. The other thing that I see is lacking pumps in the gym, which we covered before. Mm-hmm. And this is because you're losing insulin sensitivity to the muscle tissue. So you're not partitioning that glucose into stored glycogen. So you're getting less pumps, you're getting that flatter look. And then the last thing that I generally see is excessive water retention. And this is actually due to like the increase in oxidative stress that comes along with and contributes to insulin resistance. So when we have oxidative stress, we also have increases in cortisol, which decrease insulin sensitivity. So it causes this full shift in water retention and water balance, which is quite noticeable, especially in females. I'll tell you, whenever I've had a woman that didn't know she was PCOS, one of the first signs that I see is her blood glucose levels and then water retention. And that's where I send her out to get blood work, and we start seeing hyperandrogenism, which, when you look at women and individuals with PCOS, one of the number one things that they have, one of the number one side effects of PCOS is insulin resistance. So it's really like, you just got to take these both objective markers, subjective markers, put them together, and then go forward. And that's why I like doing both, because back in the day when I was the only one that was into blood glucose for myself, I was only getting these subjective markers and then I was taking the next step. But now that I do this from the front, I'm able to mitigate this first and foremost, but I'm not only able to be proactive about it, but if I see someone trending towards a certain level before they get insulin resistance, I'm able to do things, to improve their insulin sensitivity and ensure that they don't get into that state, which we want to avoid.
I love that you gave those reference ranges for the things that like you like within the larger reference range for general population. So I was making notes of the ranges that you like for these things, and I was also simultaneously checking my recent blood work to see where I ranged within your range, and I was like a decibel outside of your range on every single one. So the glucose, you said 70 to 85, and I was 88. And then you said hemoglobin was 5 to 5.2, and I was 5.3. And then the other one was 2.6 or 2. Your range was 2.4, 2 to 4. Your range was 2 to 4, and mine was 4.5. So I was literally like a decimal outside of all of your ranges, but within like the general population range. And I think Aaron even mentioned that because I had black coffee, that could throw those numbers slightly high. Is that right?
If you had black coffee that had a stimulant in it, it could throw off blood glucose levels. So generally, whenever I have someone do blood work, I have them hydrate with about 1 liter or more of water, just so that we don't have dehydration. So, for instance, in your case, actually, the fact that you had low sodium in your blood work could have been just from the diuresis effect from black coffee. But I usually just like them completely fasted. I want nothing to impact blood glucose. Coffee, there's some back and forth debate as to whether it does influence blood glucose levels. I have had certain clients that will forget. So for instance, when I had them do blood glucose testing in the morning, it's completely fasted. They can drink a little water if they want, but just wake up within a few minutes, let yourself calm down. If you're someone that's very stressed in the morning, take your blood glucose within 15 minutes of waking. Sometimes I'll have a client take down coffee and it will be slightly off, but it's not like we could go back and do it fasted and then also do it right after drinking the coffee. So there's some debate on whether it impacts. And also I always say this, it's based on the genetically individual, interdependent individual. So you could respond differently than I could.
Right. Well, yeah, I did it like 3 hours after waking because it was like a full blood panel and I had to like go to LabCorp and do that whole thing. So I had my normal like black coffee with caffeine in the morning. And then my sodium levels weren't actually low. They were right in the middle of the range. But Aaron, what was it? You saw it with my kidneys that gave you the idea that maybe I was dehydrated or too
Oh
diluted or
man,
something
it
like
might have
that?
been the alkaline phosphatase, the LDH, or maybe it was the uric acid. I forget. There was a couple
Yeah,
things.
there were
They're
a
not
few
one.
things that alluded you to believe that I was not that I was a little bit dehydrated. I thought it was through kidneys, but I'm not really
Oh,
sure.
yeah, it was that. It was your the
It was your EGFR.
your EGFR. Yes.
Yeah, that's your estimated glomerular filtration rate. So that actually does get highly impacted. So any of your kidney values will get, that bun, creatinine, all those will get impacted, especially if you're in a fasted state and you're dehydrated. That's why I always do that liter. And I
Well, I
actually
drank a
tell
ton
you,
of water. Yeah.
yeah, I try to. Well, remember, hydration's not just about water. That's the thing. So it's about the mineral balance as well. So
Yeah.
it's hard to really nail it, but that is a marker that you could be dehydrated or lacking sodium or lacking more so electrolytes than it would be water.
Interesting. Yeah, because I drink so much water. It's the sodium. We're starting with the sodium, but maybe it's other electrolytes as well. So I'll just have to
Yeah.
kind of keep tabs on all of that.
Honestly, just Brian, just for we talk about this offline, but the number one deficiency I see in electrolytes are both potassium and magnesium because potassium, the daily recommended value is 4,700 milligrams. I can't tell you, I can't tell you how many I've seen. I've worked with close to 1,000 clients at this point over 9 years, and I've probably had maybe 20 people come to me that had in range potassium when they came to me. So, it's not only on blood work, I'm saying daily value in terms of like chronometer
Oh, as
or
far as how much you
yeah,
take in. Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Interesting. Well, I supplement with ZMA, so I should be getting enough zinc and magnesium in. And now I have sodium, so I guess I need to now take a look at how much potassium I'm consuming throughout the day. What does a banana have?
I don't know. It's actually not that high. You would get more from a
Okay.
sweet potato.
I eat a
Yeah.
lot of sweet potatoes too, so I should be all right on that. Cool. Good to know. Well, awesome. I think we have one more question. Yeah. How do we
Yeah.
improve our insulin sensitivity and reduce or reverse insulin resistance?
All right. So I have a list that I go through with clients because, like I said, this is a multifaceted issue. So we need to take a multifaceted approach. So, like I said, it's never one thing. It's never just carbohydrates. It's never just sugar. It's never just fat. It's never just stress. It's a combination of all these things. So we have to take a multi-pronged approach to truly optimize things because when you only do certain things in isolation, it's going to take much more time to improve insulin sensitivity or put insulin resistance in remission. So the first thing I do to improve insulin sensitivity is to look at it from a dietary perspective. Like I alluded to before, diet is the main driver of insulin resistance. So I'll take one of two nutritional approaches. I'll either do a primer phase, which would be prior to like a prep or a diet, or if someone's in like an off season and they're interested going back into a muscle building phase, we'll do a mini cut. So in both approaches, it's a very similar, or in both methods, it's a very similar approach. I'm going to be pulling back on calories as the excess of energy is what's the leading cause of the insulin resistance and that lack of insulin sensitivity. So the goal here is to lose body fat and get leaner. We've seen in research that anywhere between a 5 to 7% reduction in body weight will cause a massive improvement in insulin sensitivity in most individuals. But I do have to put a caveat on that. For those that are obese and already insulin resistant or who have type 2 diabetes, you have to increase that to 10 to 15% loss of starting body weight to truly see a restoration in their beta cell function. But these are for like more extreme cases. So for most people that are listening here, 5 to 7%. So for instance, that could be for a 200-pound male, that could be 10 pounds of loss is going to have a significant increase in insulin sensitivity and lowering of blood glucose, lowering of fasted insulin, and all those other markers that I went over. So often what I'll do in terms of nutrition is that I'll pull back on total calories and then place carbs predominantly around the peri-workout window. And this is when a client or anyone that's training is most receptive and sensitive to these nutrients, especially carbohydrates. So during the training, during, post, I'm putting most of their carbohydrates. Then throughout the rest of the day, I'm looking to balance blood sugar out so they don't have these highs and lows that they've been dealing with. So most of the rest of the day would be like complete lean protein sources and then like fiber containing micronutrient rich veggies as the foundation for their meals. And then I'll utilize either a fat source to balance that out or maybe a slower digestion carbohydrate or something based along their preference. But this all depends on a client's starting point. So if they're in a growth or gaining phase and pushing high carbs, cutting back on the total daily carb intake is going to be the most sensible play to go with because it's going to be the most easy to implement. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, if I have individuals that are following a very high fat intake and a more moderate carb approach, I'll leave carbs where they're at and I'll pull back mostly on fat because that's what's taking up the most of their calorie surplus. So really what I'm trying to do is get body fat down, get body weight down, improve those through nutritional components. And generally what I see is within 4 to 6 weeks, I'm seeing a massive improvement in terms of insulin sensitivity, pumps in the gym, performance, energy, especially because a lot of times when you are insulin resistant, remember, I talked about different tissues, muscle, liver, brain. So they call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, and that's for a reason. Your brain is insulin resistant due to the high fluctuating levels of insulin and blood glucose. So we have to think about it does have cognitive effects as well. So if you're a high level professional, oftentimes when I work with those guys, I work with a lot of people that work in New York City, and they'll be like, dude, I feel so clear headed. So it's within those 4 to 6 weeks. And then within that diet model, I also look to increase metabolic flexibility through calorie cycling. So if you're someone who's metabolically flexible, you're easily able to switch between using different fuel substrates, whether that be carbs or fats, and you're able to oxidize or essentially burn them for energy. And then we see that those who are overweight are oftentimes labeled as metabolically inflexible due to the fact that they have tons of stored fat in their cells, which doesn't allow for proper uptake of glucose and glycogen storage. So these individuals also suffer from insulin resistance due to the excess amount of energy that they're chronically taking in, which has made their cells resistant to insulin. So with that, we see that they're not responding well to fats and they're not responding well to carbohydrates. So the goal with my diet model is to increase metabolic flexibility so that your body can go between both fuel substrates. So what I do with that is generally what the construct of the diet is on training days, I'll put them in a higher carb and lower fat approach. So they're having a fuel substrate that's more paired towards their nutrition, or their nutrition is more paired towards their training, because that's when they're going to do more glycolytic work. They're going to need more glucose, both for energy as well as for resynthesis of glycogen storage. And then on off days, I'm going to utilize a more higher fat and lower carb approach, which is just going to help with in terms of fueling more of like brain activity, ketone bodies, things of that sort. And they're able to get more of an elicited effect where they're switching back and forth and their body's getting better at utilizing both. So other nutritional approaches that I'll utilize is I might switch up meal timing. So we know that there's some chrononutrition that points out that you're most insulin sensitive in the morning. So I may allocate more carbs earlier in the day and then less towards the evening. And I often do that with lifestyle clients who may not train as often, so we're not using as much of a peri-workout approach, or they're people that the whole peri-workout bolus just doesn't work for them. It's a little bit too much into the details, and it's easier for me to say, listen, we're going to do a high carb breakfast. Most of your calories are going to come in the morning, and then we're going to slowly titrate towards less calories throughout the evening so that you're utilizing nutrients when you're most insulin sensitive. Because they may, I work with endurance athletes, I work with people that don't weight train, and I would love for everyone to weight train, but not everyone does. So we have to utilize things that are going to be conducive to the person's lifestyle. So I never try to fit a diet. I'm never trying to fit a client to a diet. I'm trying to fit a diet to a client and their lifestyle. And then another thing, Brian, you actually hit on this earlier, was utilizing like intermittent fasting. Mm-hmm. So I'll do that with certain clients, and it could be through like one daily fast per week, or through a time-restricted feeding method like intermittent fasting. So pretty much why I do this is it provides us like an easy opportunity to create more of a calorie deficit, and also gives your pancreas as well as your digestive system some time off. So it doesn't have to be constantly processing and assimilating nutrients, which allows you to burn off more of those stored fuel substrates that you have in excess, which in and of itself, they've done studies on intermittent fasting. It does increase insulin sensitivity through increasing metabolic flexibility. So the methods that I found to be best with this is to either do a once weekly 24-hour fast on a day that a client isn't busy, like a Sunday, some day that they can just relax. They don't have a lot of responsibilities or a lot of things that they have to run around on, because like I said, these people are insulin resistant. So they're not properly utilizing nutrients, so they are sluggish and stuff. Or I'll use this with like someone in the off season where I won't have them train on a Sunday and they're in a surplus, but I want to make sure that they maintain insulin sensitivity. So this could be my bodybuilders, this could be my competitive athletes. And I say, listen, Sundays are your low intensity day. All you do is go for a morning walk in the morning with your family. Let's utilize a fast. You're in a surplus all week. Let's make sure that we increase insulin sensitivity through that. Or another approach, which is a little bit easier to implement, which I utilize myself, is using like that lean gain 16-8 window, where we'll utilize a 16-hour fast on our off training days and then just eat within that 8-hour window. And that gives us a longer period of time without the pancreas having to be burdened by excessive carbohydrate or excessive calorie intake in and of itself. So then from there, I go into tackling things from a training and activity perspective. So when we think of blood sugar management, we need to realize that blood glucose is a sink. So the amount of lean body mass you have determines how large of a sink you have. So muscle determines how much glucose or how much sugar you can handle. So let's think about it like if we have a sink and that's muscle, exercise is the drain for your sink, which is why those who exercise can consume more carbohydrates and total calories and handle them better than those that don't. So the first thing I'm doing with someone who's insulin resistant is looking to get them to resistance train, either start resistance training or resistance train more, both for the benefits it provides in increasing lean body mass, but also for the glucose disposal properties it provides. And this is due to the fact that the simple act of weight training, so just going into the gym, whether it be a circuit, whether it be a hard hypertrophy session, whether it be a CrossFit session, a Metcon, just having muscular contractions under load in and of themselves activate an insulin-independent method of controlling glucose. So training causes an upregulation in one of the main glucose transporters called GLUT4. So GLUT4 is essentially the glucose transporter that is predominantly found in muscle tissue. So when we activate GLUT4, it essentially it essentially activates the insulin receptor where it's translocated to the cell membrane and allows for glucose uptake to be translocated, after a hard workout. So the big thing about this and why I really like utilizing this is that it's insulin independent, meaning you do not need insulin after a workout to get carbohydrates absorbed. So think about it. If you're insulin resistant or lacking insulin sensitivity, your body's constantly pumping out insulin. Whereas, it's using insulin mediated mechanisms to dispose of glucose and to transport them into different tissues. Now, when you've trained, you've upregulated glucose transporter 4, and you're able to upregulate and absorb carbohydrates into muscle without utilizing insulin. So it's a perfect opportunity to lower insulin levels and to still get carbohydrates into the tissues we want, which is into muscle tissue. So this is where I'm like really big into, people doing weight training. We've seen there was a study that I actually saw it's based in 2017 by Cruz that they had type 2 diabetics do a resistance training circuit, and it was like low intensity. It was like 40% or 30% VO2 max or maximum intensity essentially. And by doing the circuit 3 days per week, they saw a 40% increase in insulin sensitivity, which essentially brought them from being a type 2 diabetic range to being in the normal range for 24 hours. So there's other research on this that is pretty incredible. Like for instance, training has been shown to increase, to help insulin resistant individuals see a 2.5-fold increase in glucose uptake. Now, when it comes to insulin sensitive individuals, so guys like us, we have good insulin sensitivity. Just exercise in and of itself, just a weight training session, has been shown to increase glucose disposal by 4-fold. And so we see that there's so many benefits of just weight training, whether it be a few times a week or more frequently, which is something that I utilize with my clients and with people that are insulin resistant. And then the next thing that I do from a training perspective is I look into adding aerobic work. And so aerobic work has been shown to increase insulin sensitivity, but here's the thing with that. It only has been shown to do so for 48 hours. So you have to do it continuously. It could be every other day, but that's going to be the maximum time that you could take off. Whereas when you build tissue, you're going to be more insulin sensitive all the time as long as you maintain that tissue. So for instance, if you go into a deload and you take a week off, you're still going to be more insulin sensitive if you have 20 pounds of more skeletal muscle tissue than someone that doesn't. And so this is where I started getting people into doing implementing post-meal walks. So what I try to utilize is 3 post-meal walks of 10 minutes, basically after high carb meals or their highest calorie meals of the day with my clients, as it's been shown to be twice as effective as some type 2 diabetes medications. So that's just a way to upregulate GLUT4 again, non-insulin mediated glucose transport. And then obviously other things that I'm looking at, we talked about this already, sleep quality that needs to be maximized. I'm shooting for, with most clientele, 7 to 9 hours a day. I'm addressing stress management because that's huge. And then another option that I'll look into, and this is going to be the last on the list, guys, and there's a reason for it. I work in the supplement industry, as I shared with you guys last time, but supplements are my last line of defense with insulin resistance. And I think that oftentimes it's the first line with many people. And they throw things at the wall and they have this kitchen sink approach, and they want to rely on something rather than changing the lifestyle habits. And never once did I say on this podcast it's a lack of a supplement, or if it was a lack of a mineral that caused your insulin resistance. It was an excess of something. It was you not sleeping well. It was you not managing stress. So why would we just add a supplement? Now, don't get me wrong. There are huge benefits to things like glucose disposal agents. I'm a big fan of GDAs. I've formulated many GDAs on the market today, and I've done so to go in conjunction with good training, proper diet and adequate activity levels. So it's a cherry on top essentially. But for anyone out there that's not familiar with glucose disposal agents, they essentially just increase your body's ability to absorb glucose. And then there's many on the market. Most of them work on the AMPK pathway, which then, it essentially translates into improved insulin sensitivity because it increases glucose receptors and their response to insulin. So the goal with these, GDAs is essentially to have muscles increase the uptake of glucose from the bloodstream through GLUT4 translocation. So through the same mechanism that we utilize through training. So these are pretty useful, especially for those that have issues with insulin resistance or are in a surplus. So often the first supplement that I'm adding in when someone's going into a steep surplus, especially with like tons of carbohydrates, I'm going to utilize something like a berberine. I'm going to utilize maybe a metformin. And those are pretty much my favorite too. There are many on the market. However, the most research has been done on metformin, which is a type 2 diabetic medication, as well as berberine. And the reason that berberine's like my number one over-the-counter supplement is because it's a natural alternative to berberine, or to metformin rather. And it's been shown that, in large doses, so 1,500 milligrams a day, it's been comparatively shown to work as well as 1,000 milligrams of the pharmaceutical metformin. So with that, we have a natural alternative that you could utilize if you don't have access to metformin. But I will say, I have many clients that utilize either one of the two or a combination of both, and they see, immense, benefits from either.
GDAs are not allowed in natural bodybuilding organizations, right? Metformin.
Metformin would not, because that is a prescription medication.
Yeah, but the natural one.
Berberine, absolutely. So berberine is just an herb. But like I said, in studies, it's been shown to be as good as metformin. The thing is, and I will make a caveat because I do suggest berberine hydrochloride to a lot of my clients, or I have over the years. I have changed that a little bit, and I actually go with it's another form of berberine now. It's called dihydroberberine. And the reason that I utilize that is that berberine can cause GI-related distress when taken in large doses. So if you look at the literature, the dose was 500 milligrams taken 3 times per day. But we know that berberine, if you look into it, it also has antimicrobial effects, which help the gut flora. So it would be used in like a GI restoration protocol. However, it causes a lot of people gastric issues. So what I've seen with clients is that sometimes they can't hold out during that period where their gut flora is kind of re-inoculating itself to that decrease in some of the microbes. So I like using the dihydroberberine, which is essentially a concentrated form. So it's 5 times as potent per milligram. So you can get a 100 milligram dose that's equivalent to 500 milligram dose, and you still get the same benefits in terms of glucose disposal. You get the same benefits in AMPK signaling. You get the same benefits in upregulating GLUT4 translocation, and you still get that same comparative effect to metformin. But I will say, I work with a lot of individuals that they don't compete, or they compete in untested organizations, and honestly, metformin works in a variety of ways. It's incredible. Like I've seen people, it works in pretty much 3 mechanisms. It inhibits production of glucose in the liver, so that's the one area. It reduces intestinal glucose absorption, and then it also improves glucose uptake and utilization. And so it's hitting on all these different mechanisms. It's helping reverse insulin resistance at the liver. It's helping reverse insulin resistance at the muscle. So it's working through all these methods, and it also has 60 or 70 years of clinical data. So it's something that's regarded as one of the most safe prescription medications that you can get. So often just like a dose of 500 milligrams at night or daily, I've seen it dramatically reduce people's insulin resistance. And, it's something I've utilized myself as well. And I've seen, immense benefits from when needed. So like I said, supplements, pharmaceuticals, this is the last line of defense. This is something to add to the rest of the protocol that I'm putting together, and that you guys listening today should be looking at, because we have to fix the high priority principles first. Then we look to the sexy add-ons.
Last kind of question for me, Brandon, and this one is a little bit hypothetical. So let's say potentially someone is having some insulin resistance and they've gone through the stress management, they've gone through other parts of the lifestyle. Have you seen any research or experienced anything where someone has maybe some dysregulation in liver, maybe some blockages in some of the detox pathways or anything like that have been potentially contributing to higher than expected glucose levels?
Yes. So here's the thing with that. So we have to realize that often when we look at insulin resistance or just insulin functioning, we only think about the pancreas, because pancreas obviously secretes insulin. The second most important organ in the body for insulin sensitivity and glucose management is the liver, because it processes, like I'm saying, it's responsible for hepatic blood sugar production. So when we're in a fasted state, we don't have carbohydrates coming in, we don't have any pancreas increasing insulin, your body is utilizing hepatic glucose production to keep us alive. If we were in, evolutionary times, it was when we were starving and we were looking for food, it was the liver that was producing blood glucose to keep us energized. However, the real reason behind, insulin resistance from that perspective is what's called etopic fat or visceral fat, essentially. So when you've essentially filled up your fat storage and you've went past the point of your subcutaneous fat, you start depositing in different areas. So when you have high circulating levels of blood glucose, it'll start shuttling. The extra, high levels of insulin will start shuttling into other compartments, which often include your organs. So it'll shuttle into the heart. You'll see intramuscular triglycerides in the heart, but often it goes to the liver. That's one of the number one predominant places. So you will see people, and that's where we get to a point, and Aaron, we spoke about this offline, that I've had a client that had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that was a predominating factor in his insulin resistance. Now, here's the thing. It's a very indiscriminate issue because there are people that are lean. There are people like this individual was a bodybuilder and he had a very, if you were to look at him visually, you wouldn't see a lot of subcutaneous fat, but he had a lot of visceral adiposity. And what's interesting is that before he came to me, he was eating a very high saturated fat diet. And we actually have research that in energy balance, meaning your calories are matched, they are at maintenance, that eating a high saturated fat diet can cause an increase in visceral adiposity and not subcutaneous adiposity, meaning those triglycerides get predominantly stored in visceral or into organ mass. So he was eating very similar to a carnivore diet, honestly. It was a lot of heavy meat, a lot of saturated fats, a lot of butter. And so it was heavy saturated fats, very low in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. So it was predominantly, I think our recommendations are no more than 10% of the diet from saturated fats. I want to say he was predominantly fat, and he was eating about 50 or 60% of his calories from fat, and about 35 to 40% of that was from saturated fat. So imagine 4 times the recommendations by most, reputable nutrition companies and stuff. And so he came to me. He had some signs of insulin resistance, high fasted blood glucose. All the markers were off, and that's where eventually we got gamma GTT done, which I recommend you get as well. Yep. And we saw that was off, so I had him go for an ultrasound, and he did have a good amount of fat deposit on his liver, and that's where he got diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it is a predominating factor, but here's the thing with that. It is less likely. Sometimes it is hereditarily involved. So if your parents or if someone in your family had it, you are more predisposed. But it also, like I said, most of what has to do with insulin resistance is lifestyle. So like in this person's, specific instance, he was a very big fan of saturated fat. So that compounded over time with stress, high levels of training. He had oxidative stress from being a bodybuilder, so using exogenous compounds. In this specific instance, he was using growth hormone, which we've known to cause insulin resistance. So before he had come to me, he had dismissed a lot of those signs because he said to himself, oh, my fasted blood glucose is high, but I take growth hormone. Well, he wasn't tracking things. And I'm not saying, this is why I give this education or I put this stuff out, because it's just critical thinking. It's if you guys see this and you see a couple warning signs, whether it's the subjective markers, you're losing your pumps in the gym, you feel foggy or cloudy headed after meals, you notice that you're adding more fat than you're gaining muscle, or that you're adding a excessive amount of body fat in a short period of time. These are all things to kind of say, all right, maybe I should check these insulin sensitivity markers and then go for the blood work, go for the fasted blood glucose, go for the HbA1c, go for the fasted insulin. And if all those are off and you utilize all these tactics, because we were utilizing, when he came to me, I started utilizing the lifestyle interventions. The diet was completely different than what he was doing. I put him in a calorie deficit. He was losing body fat. He was losing body weight. We checked off every single box. He still had high fasted blood glucose levels. He still had high postprandial, which was the most important to me because he was having what's called a MAGE index, which is medium or mean average glycemic excursion. That's it. And so from there, he was having, that means what your fasted is compared to your postprandial, he was over 50, which is enormous. So he was waking up at 100, and then postprandially, he was at 150 or more. So it was a huge variability between that. And what we really see in literature is we want to be between 30. So say if you wake up at 85, 90, you want to be around 120, 2.5 hours after meals. If you're above that, maybe you need to reduce the carbohydrates in that specific meal, or you need to, change around your nutritional composition, your calorie intake, and things of that sort.
Yeah, I mean that's. I'm glad I wanted to dive into that a little bit because I know from offline conversation we've had, there's a little bit more. I wouldn't say a little bit more, but there is incidence of that out there. Just for anyone who has gone through those
Absolutely.
checkdowns and was looking.
And
Um,
that's a case where we look at something like, when it comes to a supplement, that's where I've utilized something like a Tudco, which is a bile salt. And so it helps with regeneration of the liver. But interesting enough, at high levels, you'll see massive benefits to insulin sensitivity. And why is that? It's because of the helping of detoxification pathways within the liver and also with helping liver health. So everything within the body, like I said in the beginning of this, a healthy body is a responsive body. If your pancreas is working well, your liver is working well, your stress is balanced, your training is adequate, your sleep is sufficient, it all adds up to you creating your best physique. And that's what this is about. It's not just about avoiding insulin resistance, it's about optimizing insulin sensitivity to be able to create your best physique, have your best performance, and live your best life. Because it's not about just what you do in the gym and in the kitchen, it's every other aspect of it.
That was such well said. Sorry to cut you off, Aaron.
no,
I
I mean I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah, the whole thing was well said. The practical takeaways at the end and the question of how do we improve it and reverse insulin resistance. That list you provided was an incredible summary of kind of all the things that were discussed prior. And I of course appreciate you guys letting me kind of talk about whey protein and fructose and my blood work and all the different things along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I love this conversation. It's something, I wouldn't say I'm passionate about, but it's something I've experienced myself, like I talked about, and having Brandon come on and really just drop a shit ton of knowledge about this. I mean, I even learned more about it as well. I think for the listeners, this is going to be an incredibly informative episode because a lot of people don't talk about this stuff. It's not a high level
Absolutely.
thing. Not a lot of people can go in depth like you did, Brandon. So I'm very gracious for you coming and sharing. I'm good. Bryan, anything from you want to wrap up before we hop
No,
off?
man, I really appreciate it, Brandon. These are always good conversations, and I thought of other rabbit holes to go down as we were discussing all that. So maybe there'll be a part three of this at some point in the future.
Hell yeah, consider me in, guys. I always happy to come on. I appreciate you guys coming, having me on, and especially letting me cover this topic. Like I kind of covered, I had spoken to Aaron and Bryan before this. I'm extremely passionate about this, and I wanted to get this information out because I lost a parent as a result of many of these conditions. And I always, not to look back because I'm kind of like a present and future focused individual, but if I knew now, or I knew then what I know now, I would have been able to help him so much more. So if I could help one person out there with understanding insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance and avoiding it, that's a win in my book. So that's what it's all about.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you as well for coming on, Brandon, with that, guys. We will talk to you next week.